It was not my voice that my son heard first on that quiet evening, but the urgent tone of a news anchor broadcasting my name. The television reported that a retired Seattle engineer named Richard Bennett had just saved at least 6 lives in a chain reaction crash outside SeaTac Airport. They said I had ignored every warning to climb into burning vehicles. Hearing this, my son dropped his phone and my daughter froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. Just 2 hours ago, they had both told me to take an Uber. My name is Richard Bennett. I am 68 years old, a retired civil engineer who always hated the spotlight. For 42 years, my late wife Linda ran our entire social life. Nothing brought me more peace than simple things, like fixing a dripping pipe, assembling bookshelves for the grandkids, or flipping burgers on a lazy Sunday. Linda used to tell me that people counted on me because I never let out a word of complaint. Perhaps she was right. Or maybe I was just terrified of weighing down the people I loved with my own struggles. That stubborn quietness would soon turn out to be my biggest regret. Just 3 days before the crash, I was standing by my wife's casket up in Vancouver. She had spent her final months there with her sister, hoping some Canadian cancer treatments might give us a miracle. I had spent months traveling back and forth, and each journey grew heavier than the last. With every departure, our farewells seemed to stretch out lingering in the air until a damp Tuesday morning brought a final, crushing silence. The service we held for Linda was intimate and quiet, just as she had requested. There were no flashy floral arrangements or grand eulogies, only our close family, a handful of old friends, and the gentle melodies she used to hum. Long after the others departed, I stood by her grave until the groundskeeper gently tapped my shoulder to say they were locking up. He told me I could return tomorrow, but I knew tomorrow felt like a whole other lifetime. The next day, I was on a brief flight back home to Seattle, with a single suitcase staring out at clouds that looked like empty snowfields. Whenever the plane hit rough air, in the old days, Linda would instinctively reach across the armrest to grab me. She absolutely despised turbulence, squeezing my fingers tight and promising that I would have to buy her a hot bowl of clam chowder if we made it down alive. I always chuckled at that, but looking at the vacant leather seat next to me now brought a quiet, aching pain. We touched down at SeaTac just before 5 o'clock. I sat quietly in my seat while the other travelers rushed to grab their luggage. There was no rush for me as my house was empty, but I opened the family group text anyway. I typed a message asking if anyone could pick me up, then stared at the screen for a full minute before sending it. A sudden urge to delete the message almost took over because asking for help has never been easy for me. I watched the text mark itself as delivered. Within 60 seconds, my son Brian sent a cold reply telling me they were too busy and that I should just take an Uber. There was no greeting, no inquiry about their mother's funeral, and certainly no check on how I was holding up. Before those 6 painful words could even sink in, my daughter Melissa chimed in on the screen, telling me I should have planned better. I stared at those words in disbelief, as if burying my wife, the woman I had cherished since I was 24, could be neatly scheduled around their busy daily calendars. I wanted to type a fierce reply. It was tempting to remind my children that their own mother had been laid to rest less than 24 hours ago. I wanted to tell them how much I needed a friendly face right then, rather than the silent ride of a stranger. But instead of starting an argument, I just typed 2 simple words, sending a brief, "no worries," through the air. I put the phone back in my coat pocket, realizing a harsh truth that you simply cannot force people to care. Stepping out of the terminal, the familiar gray Seattle sky welcomed me with a cold, damp drizzle on the pavement. People around me were hugging, laughing, and heading home, while my entire world had shattered. I dragged my heavy bag toward the rideshare zone, my joints aching with pure fatigue. Sleep had been a stranger to me for weeks, barely getting 3 hours of rest each night. While waiting for my ride, I saw an older lady struggling to hoist a heavy bag over the concrete curb. Stepping in without a second thought, I asked if she needed help. She looked up with relief, asking if I was sure, and I easily swung the luggage into the back of her son's vehicle. She thanked me warmly, wishing that someone would show me the same kindness one day. Right as I smiled back, a deafening blast tore through the damp air. The terrifying sound of crushing metal and shattering glass echoed as a massive fuel truck jackknifed on the airport road. Cars collided, flames erupted, and thick black smoke filled the Seattle sky. Panic paralyzed the crowd, with some people pulling out their phones to record, while others scrambled away in terror. Decades ago, I had trained extensively in emergency rescue drills, and that deep-seated training kicked in instantly. I threw my bag aside and started moving. A bystander grabbed my arm, yelling for me to stay back, but I tore myself away and told them to dial 911. Racing toward the wreckage, I saw a burning sedan with jammed doors. A young mother was frantically beating against the glass, her little daughter sobbing in the back seat. The sharp odor of fuel was everywhere, and despite shouts that it would blow, I knew I had to act. I scooped up a heavy piece of broken concrete from the road. Putting all my remaining strength into the blow, I smashed the heavy rock against the car's side window. It took 3 hard strikes before the glass finally gave way and shattered. I screamed at the mother to cover her face, clearing the sharp pieces away as she shielded her young child. Sirens were beginning to wail in the distance, but they were still minutes away and time was running out. I knew in my heart that Linda would never forgive me if I just stood by and let someone lose the people they loved. When a police officer finally arrived and tried to pull me back, I refused, pointing toward an overturned vehicle nearby. Through the shattered windshield, we could both see a hand pressed against the glass. The officer sprang into action immediately, waving over 2 firefighters and shouting for them to help me. Up until that point, the intense rush of adrenaline had completely masked how violently my hands were shaking. Now the sharp sting of deep cuts across my palms from the broken glass began to register. The sleeve of my jacket was scorched from the heat of the car door, and my knees felt bruised from kneeling on the rough pavement, but I barely felt it. As rescue crews worked on the overturned vehicle, I heard a paramedic call out that the little girl was breathing. I closed my eyes, sending a silent thank you to my late wife. It took nearly 45 minutes for the scene to calm down. Dozens of emergency response vehicles had completely blocked the main entrance to the airport, causing traffic to back up for miles. An officer walked over to me with a clipboard asking for my details, so I told him my name was Richard Bennett, age 68. He looked at my bloodied hands and suggested I get into an ambulance, but I told him I had survived worse. He chuckled, mentioning his own wife always said men over 60 were stubborn, but the word wife sent a fresh wave of grief through me. I quietly told him I had just buried my wife yesterday. His face fell, and he apologized deeply. We spent the next 20 minutes going over my statement, though bystanders kept interrupting. A woman nearby spoke up, insisting to the officer that I was leaving out most of what I had actually done. When asked what she meant, another witness stepped in explaining that I had run back into the danger zone 3 separate times. A young student added that while everyone else was busy recording on their phones, I kept heading back into the flames. I tried to dismiss it, pointing out that the fire crews were doing the real work, but they insisted my actions bought them those precious minutes. Eventually, a young paramedic guided me to the back of an ambulance to clean my hands. She asked if I had any family who could come collect me, but I quietly told her that no one was coming. When she gently asked if my family had been notified about what happened, I simply cleared my throat and told her they were busy. She watched me closely, her quiet professionalism stopping her from digging any deeper into my personal life. Instead, she handed me a cold bottle of water and expressed her hope that I would find a safe ride home. Just then, a local television reporter named Emily Harper from King 5 News approached with her cameraman. She asked for an interview, but I shook my head, telling her I had no interest in being in the spotlight. She explained that the fire crews believed several lives would have been lost without me, but I just looked away at the flashing emergency lights. I am just glad they are still breathing, I told her. The young woman looked at me, hoping for a grand speech. Is that really all you want to say? She asked. I simply nodded, and to her credit, she did not press further. She gave me a respectful nod and turned away. I appreciated that more than she knew. My late wife Linda always admired people who had the grace to accept a simple no as a complete sentence. Since the airport roads were blocked by emergency vehicles, a kind police officer insisted on driving me to a nearby hotel. He told me I had no business wandering around in the cold, and he was right. Minutes later, I checked into a quiet room with beige walls and a window overlooking the wet parking lot. For the first time all day, the world was completely silent. I gently placed Linda's small travel bag on the wooden dresser. Inside was that soft blue sweater she insisted on packing even though she rarely wore it. It still carried the faint, sweet scent of her favorite perfume. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the fabric to my chest, and that was when the tears finally came. It was not because of the fiery crash, or because my scraped hands were beginning to throb, but because I realized I would never again receive a text from her asking if my plane had landed safely. Meanwhile, across town, my children had no idea where I was. Brian was finishing dinner with his family, and Melissa was busy with her daughter's school project. They had not yet seen the news, assuming I had simply taken an Uber home from the airport. As my son Brian later confessed to me, his wife Karen had pointed out that he really should have picked me up from the airport. He had just sighed, claiming he had an important client dinner he could not miss. But about an hour later, his phone started buzzing. First it was a neighbor, then an old college buddy, a former coworker, and finally his boss. When he answered, his boss asked him if his father was indeed Richard Bennett, urging him to immediately turn the television to Channel 5. The line went dead before Brian could even ask what was going on. He grabbed the remote and turned it on, only to find the screen filled with chaotic, live helicopter footage of the airport crash. There was thick smoke, fire, and a sea of sirens as the camera slowly zoomed in. On the screen, a gray-haired man wearing a dark jacket was seen crawling through the shattered window of a burning sedan. Brian leaned closer to the screen as Karen gasped in horror. The news anchor then announced my name, identifying me as Richard Bennett, a retired Seattle resident who had repeatedly rushed into the active crash zone before first responders could even secure the area. Then the broadcast cut to a shot of me, standing near an ambulance, blood dripping down my sleeve. The reporter noted that witnesses described me as remarkably calm amidst the terrifying chaos. Karen turned to Brian, asking if that was really me, but he was too choked up to reply. Meanwhile, across town, Melissa got a call from her friend Diane, who told her I was on every local station. Melissa laughed nervously at first, thinking it must be some kind of mistake. But when she switched on her television, she immediately gasped and covered her mouth as the video of me replayed on a loop. The news broadcast even displayed a timeline of my evening, showing airport security footage and a screenshot from our family group chat. The reporter explained that I had just landed from Canada after burying my beloved wife. Tears instantly flooded Melissa's eyes as she thought of her mother. She realized she had been so caught up in her own busy life, her work deadlines, and her children's schedules that she had completely ignored my grief. She had not even considered how devastatingly lonely that flight home must have been for me. On the screen, they showed me walking all alone through the terminal with just a single suitcase, with no family there to greet me. My daughter Melissa whispered my name through her tears, realizing how isolated I was. Back in my hotel room, my phone remained face down on the nightstand, entirely ignored. I did not hear the endless vibrations, nor did I see the desperate calls and messages flooding in. For the first time in years, my family actually wanted to find me. When I woke up just before 6 the next morning, there were a few fleeting seconds of peace where I forgot that Linda was gone forever. But then my hand reached across the bed and touched only cold, empty sheets. Reality rushed back, heavy and absolute. I left the television off because I had absolutely no desire to see my face on the local news. Over my 40-year career, I had always solved problems quietly from behind the scenes, never seeking or wanting recognition. Linda used to joke that I would rescue the entire neighborhood and then slip away before anyone could say thank you, and she was absolutely right. When my phone kept buzzing relentlessly on the nightstand, I finally picked it up and found 43 missed calls along with dozens of unread texts from my children, neighbors, and old coworkers. The first message from Brian asked where I was, followed by another apologizing. Melissa's messages were equally desperate, pleading with me to answer and begging me not to be alone. I stared at those frantic text messages without replying to any of them. It was not out of spite or a desire to make them suffer, but simply because I was not ready to talk. There are times when grief is so heavy it leaves absolutely no room for words, and this was one of those times. Around 8 in the morning, a soft knock sounded at my door. Opening it, I was surprised to find Emily Harper, the young reporter from the crash site. She looked genuinely embarrassed to be there. After I asked how she had tracked me down, she explained that the hotel manager had recognized my face from the morning broadcast. She quickly promised she was not there for an interview, and for some reason I believed her. She then said she had a message from the hospital. Hearing her mention the hospital made my stomach instantly tighten with anxiety. "Is she going to make it?" I managed to ask. Emily smiled gently and assured me that the little girl was going to be completely fine. I closed my eyes, letting out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, and whispered a quiet thank you to God. She told me the girl's parents wanted me to know she was already asking about the brave man who broke her car window. A small laugh escaped my lips before I could stop it, and I remarked that her parents had probably warned her never to climb through broken glass. Emily smiled, adding that they wanted me to visit her. Before she left, she warned me that about 20 reporters were waiting outside. While I was hiding away in that hotel, neither of my children slept a wink. At 7 that morning, Brian and Melissa met outside my house, the very place where they had grown up, and the home that Linda had loved so deeply. Brian used the emergency spare key I had given him years ago to unlock the front door. To them, everything inside looked exactly as it always had. Linda's favorite rocking chair was still positioned by the front window, and my worn work boots were lined up by the garage. But the comforting scent of fresh morning coffee was entirely missing. For over 40 years, Linda had always made coffee before I woke up. Now the kitchen felt cold and hollow. Walking into the dining room, Melissa noticed a small vase on the table containing dried lavender. Melissa whispered to Brian that our mother always placed fresh lavender in that vase right before our wedding anniversary. They stood there in total silence for almost a full minute, the quietness of the empty house heavier than any words they could say. To distract themselves, they decided to tidy up the place before I got back. While Melissa was dusting the bookshelves in the living room, she spotted an old cedar chest tucked away under the stairs. Brian walked over and told her it belonged to their mother. Inside the unlocked chest, they found family photo albums, old letters, and 6 leather-bound journals, each marked with a year in Linda's handwriting. Melissa picked up the latest one, hesitating, but Brian gently suggested that maybe Linda wanted them to read it. Neither of them felt entirely right about it, but Melissa slowly opened the cover anyway. The early pages were filled with ordinary family memories of dinners, birthdays, and vacations. But then, one specific entry stopped both of them completely cold. Linda had written about the day I sold my beloved fishing boat. She wrote that Brian believed we still owned it, but I had begged her never to let him know the truth. I had used every dollar from that sale to help fund the down payment on Brian's first home, knowing his pride would never let him accept it. As Brian read those words, his face went pale. Melissa turned the page to find another entry about her own divorce, revealing I had quietly emptied my retirement account to pay her lawyer. Linda had written that sometimes love sounds like a joke told to cover up a deep sacrifice. We had always joked that we simply wanted a smaller, more manageable house, and Melissa wept as she realized we had downsized only to support them. As they kept reading through those journals, they uncovered decades of secrets I had kept hidden. They read about how I took on consulting jobs after retirement, not because I was bored, but because Brian's business was failing. They saw how I kept driving my old broken-down truck so Melissa's daughter could get braces, and how we skipped vacations to pay for their college tuitions. Then Melissa found an entry written only 4 months ago. Through her tears, she read that the doctors in Vancouver believed there was one last treatment for Linda. My late wife Linda wrote those words in her diary, and reading them now tore my heart open. She had written about how I insisted we try every treatment, withdrawing almost all of our retirement savings. She knew exactly what it cost me, even though I smiled through it all. If she did not survive, she prayed our children would never mistake my quiet nature for indifference. Hearing those words, my son Brian leaned forward, his shoulders shaking as his voice cracked. He confessed he always thought I was just cheap. Melissa wiped tears from her face, and so did I. Neither of them had ever asked why I drove a 12-year-old pickup or wore the same old winter coat. They just accepted it because acceptance is easier than curiosity. My daughter-in-law Karen arrived at the house around noon with some sandwiches, immediately sensing the heavy tension in the room. When she asked what happened, Brian simply handed her one of Linda's journals. She read just 3 pages before quietly sitting down beside her husband and whispering how sorry she was. Brian stared blankly at the floor, guilt eating at him for telling me to take an Uber right after we buried my wife. Karen tried to comfort him, but he kept repeating that he had not even asked if I was okay. While they sat there, I was across the city sitting alone on a wooden bench overlooking Elliott Bay. The salty breeze carried the scent of the sea, a view Linda loved so much. A sad smile crossed my face as I stared at the water, and then my phone began to ring once more. This time, I decided to answer it. For several seconds, my son Brian could not find his voice on the other end. Finally, through his quiet tears, he uttered just 4 words, "Dad, come home." Those words echoed in my mind long after the call ended. They were the exact words I had desperately wanted to hear 24 hours earlier, but now they arrived just a little too late. I did not hang up on him, nor did I yell or ask why he suddenly cared. I simply told him I was not ready yet and hung up to protect my fragile heart. I spent the rest of my afternoon walking slowly along the Seattle waterfront. I watched the massive green and white ferries glide slowly across the waters of Elliott Bay, packed with regular commuters going about their daily routines. Business people rushed to their meetings, tourists snapped photos, and street musicians strummed their guitars near Pike Place Market. It made me realize that life never pauses just because one family falls apart. Linda understood this truth better than anyone. She used to squeeze my hand during hard times and remind me that the world keeps turning and we must decide to keep walking with it. But I was not sure I knew how to do that anymore. Every single corner of Seattle reminded me of her, from the local bakery to her favorite bookstore. Memories of the small seafood restaurant overlooking the waterfront, where Linda and I celebrated our 40th anniversary, flooded my mind. Every single memory felt beautiful, yet every single one of them hurt deeply. Suddenly, my phone rang again, but this time it was not Brian. It was Emily Harper, the reporter. I answered and reminded her that we had agreed on no interviews. She paused and explained that she was not calling for a television segment. She told me the mayor and governor wanted to present me with an award, but I told her I was not interested. Then she mentioned that she wanted to tell my story correctly since every other news station was currently calling me a hero. I told her flat out that I did not feel like a hero, but she explained that people were already starting to invent stories about why I was at the airport alone. She believed the public needed to know the truth because loneliness is something so many people can relate to. Her honesty surprised me. She gently shared that her own father had passed away alone in a nursing home during the pandemic, and she never got to say goodbye. I felt a pang of sorrow and apologized, recognizing her grief. She had spent 4 years wishing for one last conversation. After a quiet pause, she promised there would be no sensationalism or attacks on my kids if I agreed to do just one interview. My late wife Linda always believed that stories should serve to heal people whenever possible, so I finally agreed to the interview. I set one strict condition: if I did not like a question, we would stop immediately. The next morning, we met in a quiet conference room at Harborview Medical Center. There was no studio audience or blinding stage lights, just 2 simple chairs, a small camera, Emily and me. Before we began, she admitted she was nervous too, which made me laugh. The producer counted down from 3, the red light lit up and Emily started. She brought up the viral airport footage, noting that millions called me brave, though I insisted the real credit belonged to the firefighters. My only thought in that chaotic moment was that there were helpless people who desperately needed assistance. When Emily asked if I was afraid, I looked down at my bandaged hands and admitted that, of course I was. But I explained that after spending 42 years loving one person through hospital stays, chemotherapy, and long nights, fear simply stops mattering. You spend so much time watching someone you love fight for their very breath that you stop asking if a situation is dangerous. Instead, you only ask if someone needs you. The room fell completely silent. Even the cameraman looked away as Emily softly transitioned, asking if I had just returned from burying my wife in Canada. After she expressed her condolences and I thanked her, she hesitated before asking the one question that changed everything. She wanted to know if my family knew I was coming home. I realized millions of viewers would want to know this, and it was my chance to expose the painful text messages and let the country judge my kids. Instead, I simply smiled and said, "They have busy lives." I explained that they are raising families, working hard and balancing heavy responsibilities, so they just could not make it. When she remarked that I did not sound angry, I told her I had experienced enough sadness that week and there was absolutely no reason to add anger to it. When the camera stopped rolling, Emily stood up and gave me a quiet, heartfelt hug. She whispered that she hoped her own dad would have answered like that if he had ever been given the chance. By noon, the broadcast was airing all over Washington, Oregon, and California, and by evening it had gone completely viral nationwide. People were not sharing it because of the rescue, but because of my simple comment about my children having busy lives. Online comment sections exploded with thousands saying those words cut deeper than any angry accusation. While millions of strangers were touched by the broadcast, my son Brian sat completely alone in his office watching it on his screen. As Brian watched me smile and defend him on television, he buried his face in his hands, whispering that he did not deserve my grace. At the same time, Melissa watched from her living room while her young daughter asked why Grandpa was saying such nice things. Melissa could not find the words to answer her. My granddaughter innocently remarked that she would never protect someone who hurt her, which only made Melissa weep harder. That evening, my front porch was flooded with beautiful flowers and handwritten notes from neighbors. Local veterans placed small American flags along my walkway, and the neighbors even mowed my grass and tended to Linda's garden without ever ringing the bell. Over across the street, our elderly neighbor, Mr. Jensen, was telling a news crew that I had been quietly looking after everyone in the neighborhood for over 30 years. He explained to the reporter how I repaired storm-damaged roofs and checked on widows during blizzards without ever accepting a single dime. When I finally drove back late that night, my house looked peaceful, except for one unexpected sight. My son Brian and my daughter Melissa were sitting quietly in two lawn chairs on the front porch. Neither was looking at their phone, and neither spoke as I climbed out of my truck. They just stood there, waiting, with nowhere else they needed to rush off to for the first time in years. With Brian standing on the left side of the porch and Melissa on the right, the yellow porch light cast long, soft shadows across the lawn. They looked younger to me, probably because I could see a rare vulnerability and uncertainty on their faces. As parents, we spend decades watching uncertainty slowly fade from our children as we teach them to navigate life. But once they are successful and grown, we silently hope they still remember how to need us. As I reached into the truck bed to grab my old suitcase, Brian quickly stepped forward, asking to carry it. For a brief second, I hesitated, but then I handed him the handle. He silently carried my bag inside, and we walked in together. It hit me right then, watching my son carry my suitcase. The last time Brian had carried one of my bags, he was probably only 12 years old. My daughter Melissa walked over to me slowly, almost as if she were afraid I might shatter if she moved too fast. To break the heavy silence, I brewed a pot of coffee. I offered a faint smile and asked, "Is this your mother's recipe?" She nodded, telling me she found it in Linda's old cookbook. I took a sip. "Does it taste the same?" Melissa laughed through her tears, saying, "It was not even close." That little moment brought a genuine smile to my face, the first real one since Linda passed away. The kitchen was crowded with sympathy cards and floral arrangements from neighbors. I quietly looked around. "You've been cleaning," I noted. Melissa lowered her eyes, admitting they wanted me to come home to a clean house. I looked around and told them how nice everything looked. Brian swallowed hard, his eyes glassy. "We also found Mom's journals," he said quietly. I glanced toward the dining room, wondering when this day would finally come. "You knew about them?" he asked. "Of course I did." "Yet you let us read them." I explained that they belonged to their mother. Brian nodded slowly, his voice cracking as he said, "We didn't know." I told him I knew, but he stopped me. "No, Dad, we really didn't know." I understood the weight of his words. We sat around the dining room table where Linda had served Thanksgiving dinner for 40 years. With no phones or TV to distract us, we just had 3 cups of coffee. Melissa reached into her purse and laid one of Linda's journals on the table. "I have read every page," she whispered. "So have I," Brian admitted. Neither looked at me. Finally, Brian spoke up. "I thought you liked working after retirement." I told him that I liked staying busy, but Brian saw right through it. "That is not why you did it, Dad. You paid my mortgage." I looked at my son. "You needed help," I said. "But you sold your boat," he insisted. I smiled and told him it was only a boat, but he countered that it was Grandpa's boat. I told him I still kept the memories. Brian shook his head, saying he would have never accepted the money if he had known. "I know," I replied. He asked why I did not tell him, and I explained that helping him was never supposed to become another burden. Silence settled over us. Melissa wiped away a tear, saying she thought I wanted to downsize. I explained that her mother wanted her to keep her dignity after the divorce. Melissa covered her face. "I kept thinking about the text I sent that you did not answer," she wept. "Dad, you should have planned better," she sobbed, her shoulders shaking. "I actually wrote those words to you. I would do anything to erase those words, Melissa sobbed. I reached across the table and placed my hand gently over hers. You cannot erase it, I told her softly, but you can decide who you choose to become after making a mistake. Brian stood up then and walked over to the kitchen window, staring out into the backyard. I have been trying to understand something, Dad, he said. I asked him what it was. When that news reporter asked if we knew you were coming home, you could have destroyed us, he murmured. You could have told everyone exactly what happened. I admitted that I could have. So why didn't you? He asked. I thought of Linda. Every choice I made seemed to lead back to her. Because public humiliation does not heal private wounds, I told him. Neither of them spoke. I asked if their mother would have wanted millions of strangers to hate them. Brian slowly shook his head. No, he whispered. Linda believed that accountability should lead to healing, not simply leave people broken. Melissa quietly asked if I was angry with them. I laughed softly. Of course I was. She frowned, saying I did not look angry. I told her I had plenty of practice. Practice? She asked. Even when you are married for 42 years, I smiled, you learn that speaking while angry usually just creates another problem to solve tomorrow. Brian laughed, recalling how Mom said I always disappeared into the garage when I was upset. I told them I was organizing screws. Melissa blinked. What I mentioned the coffee cans labeled 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, and 3/4 of an inch. Brian smiled, realizing I was not organizing anything. He asked what I was actually doing. I told him I was waiting until I could answer kindly. The room grew quiet. Melissa whispered that she wished she had learned that sooner. I looked at her and said softly, "It is not too late." A few days later, we drove together to the cemetery. Linda's ashes had been placed in the beautiful memorial garden overlooking Puget Sound, exactly where she had asked to rest. The three of us stood there in silence, holding fresh white lilies. Brian finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper, as he said, "I'm sorry, Mom." Melissa nodded beside him, admitting she had forgotten how much both of us carried. A gentle breeze moved through the evergreen trees. For a second, I almost expected Linda to appear and tell us we were standing too close together. Just like her old joke that family pictures looked better when everyone spread out. Instead, there was only a peaceful, quiet silence filled with memories. Brian looked at me. "I spent years assuming you would always be there, Dad." I replied that I had hoped I would. He confessed he never stopped to think that someday I might actually need them. I gently placed the fresh flowers beside her marker. Parents spend the majority of their lives teaching their children how to walk. I looked at both of my children, my heart heavy but full. The hardest lesson I realized is teaching them how to walk back to you. Hearing that Brian broke down completely, wrapping both of his arms around me in a tight embrace. It was not the quick, awkward hug that adult sons so often give their fathers. Instead, it was the desperate, holding-on grasp of a little boy who had finally realized just how close he had come to losing the man who had quietly held his life together. Melissa stepped forward and joined us, wrapping her arms around both of us. The three of us stood there, crying beneath the tall evergreen trees, as the warm afternoon sun broke through the gray clouds. For the very first time since Linda's funeral, the crushing weight of loneliness lifted. That evening, Brian surprised me by canceling a major business trip, and Melissa rearranged her entire work schedule. Neither of them announced what they had done, and neither of them asked for any praise. They simply stayed with me. We ordered some local pizza and played cards around the table, exactly the way Linda used to love. Outside, the grandchildren ran through the grassy backyard, their laughter echoing through the air until the sun dipped below the horizon. I watched them from the quiet comfort of the back porch, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. Brian came over and sat down beside me. "Dad," he said softly. "Yes, son, I cannot change what I texted you," he admitted, looking down. "No, you can't," I replied, "but I can spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to read anything like that again," he promised. I looked at my son, then at my daughter playing on the lawn. People often think of revenge as getting even, but sitting there, I realized the best response to neglect wasn't punishment. It was watching the people who forgot your worth finally learn to value your presence before it is too late. People often assume that healing from a great loss happens all at once in a sudden wave of relief. But it doesn't. True healing arrives quietly, one ordinary day at a time, in the smallest moments. A week after Linda's memorial service, I woke up before sunrise, a habit I had kept for most of my adult life. For a brief second, I reached my hand toward the other side of the bed, only to find it cold and empty. It seems some habits outlive the people we love the most. Instead of letting the heavy silence swallow me up, I got dressed, brewed some coffee, and stepped out onto the back porch. The garden was glowing under the soft morning light, and Linda's favorite roses were in full bloom. She always told me they did not bloom because of her gardening skills, but because someone took the time to notice them. I smiled, realizing people are not much different. At exactly 8 o'clock, a familiar truck pulled into my driveway. It was my son, Brian. My son had not come over because something was broken, or because he needed money, or even because he wanted my advice. He simply walked onto the back porch carrying 2 warm cups of coffee. "I figured yours would be cold by now," he said with a small smile. I laughed softly, admitting he was entirely right. He sat down beside me without another word. For several quiet minutes, we just watched the birds hopping across the green lawn. Finally, Brian broke the peaceful silence. "I canceled my Wednesday morning meetings," he said. I looked at him. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he replied softly, "but I wanted to." That simple sentence meant more to me than he would ever truly realize. When your children are young, you give them time because you have to. When they grow up, giving time becomes a choice, and Brian was finally making that choice. Melissa was changing too, stopping by after work every single Thursday evening. Sometimes my daughter brought over a bag of groceries, and sometimes she brought homemade soup that never tasted quite as good as Linda's used to. She was the first to admit it, though. "I still cannot make your wife's chicken noodle soup," she sighed one evening. I smiled and told her no one could. "But I even followed her exact recipe," Melissa protested. I chuckled, explaining that her mother always left one key ingredient out of her written recipes. "What ingredient was that?" she asked. "Patience," I replied. Melissa laughed, claiming that patience is not an ingredient, but for Linda, it truly was. Soon those Thursday dinners became something we all looked forward to. There were no special occasions, no birthdays to celebrate, just a family sharing a simple meal. It was something we should have never stopped doing. The grandchildren noticed the shift before anyone else, and one Saturday afternoon, my oldest grandson, Ethan, wandered into my garage, looking around at the shelves lined with tools. Ethan looked up at me and said, "Dad says you built almost everything in this house." I smiled at him. "Most of it," I admitted. Then he looked at me with wide eyes and asked, "Can you teach me?" Those 4 simple words filled a hollow place inside my heart that I had not even realized was empty. For the next several hours, my grandson and I worked side by side, building a simple wooden birdhouse. He measured twice, cut once, missed a nail, laughed, and tried again. By the time the sunset painted the sky, our birdhouse leaned slightly to one side. "It isn't perfect," Ethan noted. I placed my hand gently on his shoulder. "Neither are families," I told him. He looked at me, understanding. "But if the foundation is strong," I said, tapping the crooked little roof, "it will still stand," he finished with a smile. I knew he would remember that moment long after he forgot about the crooked wood. A month later, the Seattle Fire Department invited me to speak at a community event. When the invitation first arrived, I almost declined. Public speaking had never been my favorite thing, and the thought of standing in front of a crowd made me uneasy. But then I remembered something Linda used to tell me whenever I hesitated. She would say, "If your experience can help someone else, it is no longer just your story." With her voice in my mind, I accepted. The community center room was packed with local retirees, young parents holding babies, college students, and local first responders. When my turn came to speak, I did not spend much time focusing on the dramatic details of the airport accident. Instead, I spoke about preparation, about keeping a cool head under pressure, about basic first aid, and about the quiet duty of looking after your neighbors. Near the end of the presentation, a man in the back raised his hand. "What made you run toward those burning cars?" he asked. The room fell silent as I thought of Linda. "My wife spent 2 years teaching me that every extra minute matters," I replied. I stood there in silence, letting the weight of the moment sink in. When someone you love is fighting for their life, you stop wasting time pretending someone else is going to save them. The audience sat still for several seconds before they all stood up, It wasn't because of me. They just finally understood. Gradually, our lives found a new rhythm. Brian started bringing his family over every Sunday, and Melissa stopped calling only when she needed a favor. Instead, she would phone just to ask what I was doing. Sometimes I was watching baseball, other times fixing the fence or simply thinking about their mother. Our talks became warmer and more real. One evening, Brian handed me an envelope containing a receipt for the retirement account. I looked up, wondering what this was about. He told me he was paying back every single dollar I had spent helping him. I gently pushed the envelope back, telling him he did not owe me a thing. When he insisted, I smiled and told him to spend that money on his own children instead. Take them camping, travel, and build lasting memories together. That is a far better investment than paying me back. Tears filled his eyes when he realized I wouldn't accept it. He asked how I had already been repaid, and I told him because you came back. A few months later, on what would have been Linda's 66th birthday, we all gathered in the backyard. The kids ran through the roses. Melissa tried making Linda's apple pie, which we laughed about because it wasn't quite right, and Brian grilled burgers, just like I had taught him. A quiet fell over the backyard as the evening sun started to dip below the horizon. Brian stood up, raising his glass of iced tea to get our attention. He looked directly at me and took a deep breath, calling me Dad. With a trembling voice, he confessed that for years, he thought success was only about providing for his own wife and son. He had forgotten that his family also included the man who had spent an entire lifetime providing for him. Looking down, he admitted he could never take back his cold text message, but he promised I would never have to wonder again if anyone was coming to pick me up. Melissa reached out and squeezed my hand in agreement. I looked around the table at my family, my eyes drifting to the empty chair we had intentionally kept open for Linda. We didn't keep that seat empty because we thought her physical ghost was sitting there, but because true love lingers long after a final goodbye. I smiled, telling them their mother would be so happy. Brian laughed softly, joking that she would actually be telling us the burgers were burning. We all laughed, and it felt wonderful. It wasn't that the pain had vanished, but that joy had finally found a place to sit right beside it. Growing older has taught me that families aren't ruined by a single terrible event. They slowly drift apart through tiny acts of neglect, unanswered texts, and postponed visits. If this makes you think of someone who is waiting to hear from you, please reach out to them today. Do not wait until regret is the only voice left. Thank you for spending your time with me.